Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at round number 3 of the Qatar Masters being held here in Doha. Now, as you guys know, yesterday was really filled with a lot of drama, but today it is back to the chessboard, and let's see how some players rebound after their shocking losses yesterday. Now, first up, we have, of course, the former 5-time world chess champion Magnus Carlsen playing with the white pieces today after a shocking loss to Suleimanov yesterday and all the drama that ensued. So, one of the difficult things about open tournaments is that even if you lose a game against a player who's pretty strong, you still get a tough pairing in the next round. And in this game, Magnus is playing against one of the plethora of Indian players in this event, Muthaiya AL, who is an IM rated 2470. Now, Magnus has the white pieces, of course, so it should be pretty smooth sailing, right? All right. So we get e4 on move 1. We get e5, knight to f3, and now knight to f6 played here by Muthaiya. Very surprising to face the Petrov this early in the tournament against a player who's not at the very top. And certainly for Magnus, I'm sure he was not happy to see this because this is one of the most solid setups and opening systems that can be played. And Magnus, of course, has faced this many, many times in both the World Championship matches against Jan Nepomniachtchi and the World Championship match against Fabiano Caruana as well. So we get the classic Petrov, knight takes e5, d6, knight to f3, and now we get knight takes e4, Magnus plays d3, knight f6, d4, and here his opponent plays g6. Now it's a pretty solid setup here from Muthaiya. However, all the pieces stay on the board in this variation, unlike quite a few of the other variations, which is very good for Magnus. So we get bishop d3, bishop g7, castles, and now we get castles, and Magnus plays move h3 here to stop Muthaiya from playing bishop g4 and trying to put pressure on the central pawn on d4. So after h3, we got b6, c4, bishop b7, knight c3, and rook e8. All this, by the way, pretty standard theory so far. So now we get bishop e3, knight b to d7, and Muthaiya has gone for the double fianchetto here with the two bishops on g7 and b7, as well as trying to play in the center of the board. Magnus, on the other hand, has a little bit of grip here in the center, a little bit more space. These knights are kind of restricted here. They have no squares to jump to. So we get rook to e1, h6 played here, and now we have d5 played by Magnus, trying to shut down this light square bishop on the diagonal. Additionally, white might want to go knight d4 and knight c6 later on as well. So we get knight to c5, bishop c2, c6 played here, trying to force open this diagonal for the light square bishop. After c6, we get queen to d2. We have c takes d5, c takes d5, and now let's move knight fe4 is played. Now, this is actually very similar to another opening, the classic Ben Oni, which comes out of a different move order where black tries to force open this diagonal by moving a knight to e4. So to illustrate it, let's go back to the very start. In the Ben Oni, there's some variations where white will play like knight c3, d6 e4. You get takes, g6, knight f3, bishop g7. Let's just say bishop e2, castles, rook e8. Let's just say a3 here. And black plays this move, knight to e4, trying to force open this nice long diagonal for the dark square bishop. Now, the structure is also quite similar with the pawns on d6 and c5 and c4, d5. Of course, in the game, the pawn is on c7, not c5. So, back to the game here. In this position after knight e4, you'll notice that Muthaiya is trying to open up the long diagonal. Magnus trades the knights, and now he takes on e4 and takes a pawn on h6. Now, it's unclear whether Magnus calculated this line to its conclusion or not, but I think Magnus realized right away that first of all, his opponent is going to have to give up the bishop pair. Black will not be able to keep two bishops on the board. Additionally, in the resulting pawn structure here after the trades, black has this weak pawn on d6. White can also create a bastion by putting the knight on d4, or even going to g5 and trying to checkmate the black king. So, Magnus's reactions during the game, since there were a couple of us who saw his game at this critical moment, it wasn't clear whether Magnus had calculated this whole line or not. He didn't seem overly happy when I saw his reaction at the moment when this was live during the game, but nonetheless, he has a good position here because the knight is simply better than this bishop. Now, what I mean by that is the bishop, it looks really nice on these diagonals, but there are no pieces to target the pawns with here. If you were to take on a2, for example, there's b3, and now your bishop is going to get trapped here on a2, very similar to when Bobby Fischer made the classic mistake against Boris Spassky in the World Chess Championship in 1972. So, after knight d4, we get queen f6, queen d2 played by Magnus, guard the knight on d4, we get rook to c8, and now Magnus plays a3 here, which is a very good fundamental move for a couple of reasons. First of all, Magnus has the choice of putting the pawns on the same color as the bishop, or on the opposite color. So now the bishop can't touch any of the pawns on the queen side here because they're on dark squares versus light squares. So the bishop can't touch any of the pawns, and now Magnus really intends to go knight b5 and target the pawns on d6 and a7. So we get a6 played here by Muthaya. Magnus plays rook to e3. We get king to g7, goes knight to e2, and now we get this move bishop c4, which is actually a serious mistake. Computer wants black to be a little bit passive here and play bishop b7, keeping the bishop on this long diagonal. And after rook d3, d5, knight d4, it looks like white is much better here, but for a computer, it just laughs in your face and says after a5, black is completely fine. Now, mind you, if I were to have this position with the black piece in a classical game of chess, I would think that I'm completely lost. It feels really, really bad because this knight on d4 is perfectly placed. You have like rook f3, h4, g3. It just feels like there should be something on the king side. But computers prove that pretty much any position can be defended. So we get the move bishop c4 played here by Muthaya. Magnus goes knight g3. We get d5 here. Now d5, very, very logical move from a human perspective to play d5, but it's actually a serious mistake. What Muthaya thinks here is he's worried about his king. The knight is kind of jumping here. There's rook f3, and he figures now you got to try to get rid of this weakness and turn it into a pass pawn and just start pushing p all up in Magnus's face. So we get d5, and here Magnus plays b3, which is actually a serious mistake. The computer says that after rook to f3, white is much better, because after, sorry, not rook e3, sorry, it's queen e5, rook e3, queen here, and then, oh, actually, I'm wrong. My weak engine on chess.com is telling me that white should play b3. That's kind of funny. So the weak engine that says b3 is a mistake, it says it's a mistake because you're supposed to go rook f3, and if black moves the queen to another square like d8, then you win after queen d4. But if black plays the correct move to queen e5, then you go back and play b3 because your opponent has actually seen that queen e5 is the best move, so you give them the chance to go wrong. Pretty dank. At any rate, back to the game. So we get b3 here, bishop d5 played by Muthaya. Magnus plays a4. We get bishop to d7 back, trying to reroute the bishop to e6, where it'll be guarded by both, where it will guard the pawn on d5 and be protected by the pawn on f7 as well. Magnus plays knight e2. We get bishop e6, knight to d4, and now the move a5 is played. Another very logical move by Muthaya, because now his pawns are on dark squares, fixing the white pawns on the light squares in the endgame. Additionally, white can't really target the pawns. In this position, if it were white's move, you could maybe get queen d3, try to weaken these pawns on the queen side here, say like rook a7, then maybe you can even go queen c3 and infiltrate, and these pawns are very, very brittle on a6 and b6. So we get a5. Magnus plays king to h2, a quiet waiting move, just trying to get the king out of any danger on the back rank here. We have the move queen to f4, g3, queen to f6, and now Magnus goes king g2, and his opponent plays bishop to d7. After bishop d7, we get g4 being played here, and now Muthaya plays the move rook to e8, trying to exchange the rooks. Now, up to this point, Magnus has very little advantage. His opponent is playing a great game so far. And here we get rook takes e8 from Magnus, bishop takes, and now the move queen e3, bishop d7, and knight to f3. Now, again, we've made time control. Magnus has a small advantage due to the weak pawns on the queen side, as well as his weakness in the center, but it's still nothing conclusive. So Muthaya plays bishop c6, which is the first step in the wrong direction. What Muthaya needed to play was queen d6, because after queen d4, it looks really scary here. But after, say, f6, if white ever goes g5 and black gets queen d6, suddenly there's some threats on the diagonal. And if you don't play g5, say you go like king g1, for example, black can play queen c5 here. And after king g2, black goes g5 and just starts waiting with the king on the king side. And the computer says it's completely equal. So Muthaya plays bishop c6, which is slightly wrong, because now Magnus gets g5. The bishop's on a diagonal, which is not going to be activated because white will put something on the d4 square, whereas on d7, it was targeting the pawn on h3. So we get queen d6, which is a blunder here, by the way. Or no, queen d6 is correct, sorry. Bishop c6 is the blunder. We get queen d6, and here Magnus takes the pawn on b6. Now, fortunately for Magnus, is move number 41, so he has some time to calculate the line, because after queen takes b6, it looks really scary with d4 coming in here, and this nice long diagonal. But Magnus correctly realizes that he can go king to f1 here, and now Muthaya plays the move king g8. Now, if black were to play d3, which looks like a really good move, just pushing d up the board, or pushing p up the board, I should say, we get queen d4 check, queen trade on d4, and after d2, king e2, white simply wins the game here. But Muthaya plays king g8, which is the absolute best move, and now Magnus has to play queen d4. If Magnus were to play knight takes pawn on d4 here, this would actually lose the game on the spot because there's bishop g2 check, creating the classic fossil, and after king takes g2, queen takes b6, we almost certainly would have a rampage of more angry tweets. Instead, Magnus plays the move queen takes d4, and now Muthaya blunders with queen e6. In this position, if Muthaya were to play queen to e7 here, the advantage is still significant for white after, say, queen e5, but after queen d7, you have to play knight d4, giving up the pawn on h3 and running your king to the center. And after queen c3, there's still a long, long way to go in terms of winning this game. And I'm not sure that I would even be able to win this against Stockfish here with the white pieces. It's that difficult. At any rate, Muthaya puts the queen on the wrong square. He goes queen e6. Magnus plays knight to e5. We get queen takes h3, king to e1. And now the big problem in this position versus the other scenario here is that black does not have a good way to guard the bishop. If we go back to this position here with queen c3, you'll see the construction of the knight and the queen. The knight cannot easily jump to either e6 or f5. Both squares are covered. And the queen on c3 guards the bishop and pressures the pawn as well as pinning the knight. But in this position here, after king to e1, you'll notice that the knight on e5 actually has some really great squares on d7 and g4 potentially. There's also queen d8 check here, and the queen on d4 stops queen c3. So because of that, black doesn't really have a good way to guard the bishop, and for that reason, white is winning. So we get queen to h1. Now Magnus goes king d2. We get the move bishop to f3 played here. And now Magnus finds knight d7, which wins on the spot because now you're getting this great bastion with the knight on f6. You have queen d8 check, and it's simply hopeless. The game concludes after queen to d1. We get king e3, queen takes b3, and now king to f4 is played here. Correctly, Magnus realizes that, again, the mating threats on the dark squares around the king are simply too much to defend against. We get bishop c6, knight to f6 is played, king g7. If black were to go king f8, there's queen to d8, king g7, and queen g8 would be checkmate here with the knight and the queen. So, in this position, we get king g7. Now we have knight to h5 played by Magnus. King f8 only move. If you go to g8 or h7, there's queen g7, checkmate in 1, GG, why not? So we get king f8, queen d6 check played here, king to g8, and now Magnus plays queen d8. And here Muthaya resigns the game against Magnus Carlsen because checkmate is unavoidable. If black were to go king h7, we have the same checkmate, knight f6, king g7, and queen g8, which is GG on the spot. And after queen d8, if black plays bishop e8, takes king h7, it's the exact same mate as well. So Magnus wins his third game after the shock loss yesterday. A very difficult game, and actually, this brings me to my next point. One thing that I think is being talked about a lot these days is what we call rating deflation in the system. Now, what I mean by that is anytime those of us who are the top grandmasters in the world play against players who are 2,500, even a little bit lower, like 2,400, so like my first game against Vantika, it's very, very difficult. It's a big grind trying to win these games against players who are 300 plus points lower rated than us. And to me, it seems as though everyone has gotten that much better overall. And it's just very, very difficult. Even for Magnus, say 40 moves, his 2470 opponent held firm before finally blundering in a difficult endgame. But players are becoming stronger and stronger. So Magnus wins. He moves to 2 out of 3. And now let's take a look at my game from the third round. Now, I am on 2 out of 2. No unfortunate surprises so far. But today in round 3 with a perfect score, I'm playing against I think it's Shashidin Vokidov from Uzbekistan. One of the most talented Uzbeki juniors. Now, he's probably out of the juniors the quote-unquote worst of the strong juniors, but he's still 2580, pushing 2600. Very, very strong. It's just that there are these guys like Noderbek Yakubov, Noderbek Abdustorov, who are phenomenal chess players. I think there also are some other juniors that I'm forgetting about as well, but very talented, definitely headed for 2650 down the road. So Vokidov starts with e4, and I decide to play a Sicilian defense here. Essentially, I don't want to be super solid. I want to take my chances. And one thing that we're seeing in some of the general chess trends these days is that for a long time, I want to say around the pandemic, maybe like 2017, 2018, 2019, everybody and their brother was playing e4, e5 every game. We were getting a lot of Gucci pianos. We were getting a lot of Berlin defenses as well. It was pretty much nonstop. But ever since I want to say maybe like 2021, 2022, a lot of players have started experimenting with Sicilian. I've started playing it quite a lot, beginning with the American Cup earlier this year. Magnus has been playing the Sicilian a lot. And even yesterday in the U.S. Championship, Fabiano Caruana trotted out a Sicilian against Ray Robson as well. So it seems like the Sicilian is back in vogue. So God bless the Sicilianos of Italy. So I play c5. We get knight to f3, and now I play knight to c6 here, exactly what I played in the American Cup. We get the move bishop b5 here, which of course is the classic Rossalimo being played by Vokidov. So after bishop to b5, I play this move d6 here. Now, I've played many lines here. I've played e6 in the past. I've played g6 recently. I also played e5 in the American Cup against Wesley So. But today I decided to play d6, which I played pretty poorly against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in the Speed Chess Championship about a month ago. So after d6, we get castles, bishop d7, rook e1, knight f6, c3. All standard theory, a6, bishop f1. White tries to build a big white center with d4 immediately, so I go bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3. Here, Volkov plays h3. I trade on f3, and now I go e6. We get knight to a3, and now I go bishop e7, knight c2, and castles. And now the idea is revealed behind this knight maneuver to the rim, which is white succeeds in getting this big white center with pawns on e4 and d4. So here I take on d4. Volkov plays knight takes pawn. If white were to take with the pawn after d5, e5, and knight to e4, black gets this temporary bash on e4. You have ideas like f6 to rip open the f-file, and D's knights in the center of the board are very well placed. So Volkov plays knight takes d4. I play d5, get knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and now we get e takes d5 and c takes d5. Now, I have actually gotten a big black center myself with the 3 pawns. There's a little bit of imbalance. White is a 3-on-1 majority on the queen side here, and on the king side, I have these 5 connected versus the 3 on the king side. So I have a little bit of p in the center. He's got p on the edge of the board. Now, I had actually prepared all this before the game up to this point, but this is where my analysis ended, and knight takes d4 was actually the first novelty of the game. So I'm feeling pretty good about myself. I've built a nice little advantage here. I've built a 25-minute advantage, but it's not so easy in terms of what my plan should be, because white now has the 2 Bs, and also ideas like c4 to try and break up this nice pawn center that I have. So after bishop e3, I play this move knight d7 after a bit of a think. Now, what I was trying to figure out here is whether there was a way to keep it in balance to try and play for a win, try to get to 3 out of 3, and not lose a couple of elo points. But as I realized very quickly, first of all, my opponent is a very strong player, one of the most talented juniors from Uzbekistan. Additionally, the risks I would have to take to keep the game going, I felt that against this opponent would be too dangerous, and I'd probably lose the game. Now, what I mean by that is one line that I wanted to play initially was, I think it was queen c7 here. And after rook a c1, I believe it was rook d8, c4, and d4. Now, after bishop f4, I thought that maybe I can try to play using these pawns in the center of the board, but there are 2 problems. First of all, I can't push the e-pawn in conjunction with the d-pawn because white covers the square, so then I can't really push the d-pawn. Additionally, if white can get these 3 pawns rolling on the queen side, for example, say a3, b4, and c5, suddenly white has 3 connected, and white is pushing p on the c-file, and I'm going to be obliterated in the next couple of moves. So I really wanted to do this, but I realized, I'm playing a very strong player. If I get a chance later, I can take it, but I can't go overboard trying to take a huge risk, because then I'm probably just going to get steamrolled by my very talented young opponent. So I play knight d7 instead here, and the idea is simple. If white goes c4, trying to activate the 2 Bs here on these diagonals, I can play knight e5, trade the knight for the bishop here, and after, say, bishop f6, rook d1, and queen c8, we end up in a very drawish endgame here, where both sides have even material, but white only has 1 B versus 2 Bs. So, rook a d1 is played instead, and now I go queen to c8 here, again, trying to stop my opponent from playing c4 and trying to keep this connect 5 of pawns in the center intact. So we get bishop d4 here, and now I go bishop f6, and I was very happy at this point, because now white will lose the 2 Bs. Unfortunately, after white loses the bishop pair, white can still play c4, basically breaking up my connect 5 here. So after c4, I take the pawn. He goes rook c1. I go queen b8. He goes queen a3, guarding the pawn on b2. I'm preparing to take the pawn on c4 on the next turn. So here I go rook to c8. Volkov plays rook takes pawn. I trade, and I go a5. Now, one dangerous thing in chess is sometimes it's very easy to go on autopilot and sort of fall asleep, where it feels like the game is very, very dry and boring. And Magnus Carlsen is one of the players who takes advantage of this a lot of times, where a seemingly innocuous endgame can suddenly become very dangerous immediately. Now, the reason I say that is because right here, the position feels very, very balanced and equal. The same number of pawns on the board. It's a bishop versus a knight. And unless white can somehow create a pass pawn on the queen side, white's really never getting anything. On the other hand, black can never really use the pawn majority, because if you ever play like e5, for example, you open up the scope for the light square bishop on c4. So basically, if white can't push p on the queen side, and I can't push in the center and use my majority or his majority, the 4-on-3, or the 2-on-1 here, the game should be a draw. So In this position, we get rook to d1 being played by Volkodov, and now I play h6. Now, I think in retrospect, I probably should have just played g6 here. And the reason I didn't play this was based sort of on deep fundamental understanding, which is that in an endgame, if pieces ever come off the board, just to illustrate this point, I'm just setting this up, you'll notice that all of these pawns are on the same colors as the light square bishop. So generally in endgames, as you're starting to approach them conceptually, you don't want to put your pawns on the same color as your opponent's bishop. So for that reason, I decided not to do it. But then there's the second question, which is that I also can play h6 or h5. Now, for the exact same reason, I did not play h5, which is I felt that if somehow we get another endgame, you'll notice that all these pawns are on the same color as the bishop, and maybe the bishop can target them in 20 or 30 moves. So I go h6, which is okay. I put the pawn on a dark square, trying to avoid any threats with the bishop. But now Volkodov plays queen f3, swinging the queen over and targeting the rook on a8. Here I go rook a7, and now he plays b3 here, keeping his 2-on-1 intact on the queen side and hoping to maybe go queen c6 or rook d6. Now, this is where I came very close to making what technically is not a blunder, but a move that I was intending to play, which could have led to a lot of trouble for me. So in this position, my intention was to play a4 here, basically with the idea that if white plays queen e3, we trade, and I get some position like this. White can never really push the b pawn up the board, and it should be a draw pretty soon. But the problem, as I realized during the game, is if I go a4, white can sack the pawn with b4 here, and if I try to capture the pawn, there's rook d8 check, king to h7, and now white has bishop d3, checking the king, and it's spaghetti-o time. If I block with the knight, I just lose the game because white has an extra bishop. And if I go g6, then white takes the horse, and there's a lobster pincer checkmate in the corner on the next turn. So here I play the move queen to e5 after a very, very long think. Now, the reason I played queen e5 here is that I couldn't figure out what to do in this position after a4, b4. I saw rook c7, queen a6, queen c8, bishop a6, queen b8. But at the end of the day, I thought this position after like queen d6 feels really scary. If white ever gets, say, a3, suddenly this pawn in a4 becomes a serious target in all endgames. And if white can even go b5, b6, it also looks very, very scary. So I decide to go queen e5. We get rook d8 check, king h7. My opponent plays queen d3, g6, and now he plays queen to d4. Now, I thought during the game that queen d6 was actually a little bit better because after the queen trade, white wants to play rook to a6 here, trading off the rooks. Now, the computer laughs in my face like it does with just about any human. It says, what are you worried about, pal? You can simply go like knight d7, and after rook a6, you can simply trade, and black is completely fine. But it looks very scary here because at the end of the day, we just set up some position like this. You'll notice that in this position, white has an outside pawn that he can start pushing up the board. And I'm going to have to use either my king or my knight to get over and stop the pawn. And it just looks a little bit dangerous. Now, of course, as I said, computer basically says this is a big pile of nothing, but you don't know that during the game. So I thought queen d6 was a better try because after queen to d4 is played, I trade the queens, but now I have rook c7 and a very simple plan of bringing the king over and playing a4. Here, Volkodov plays f3, and now once I get to play this a4 move and trade off my one lone weak pawn on the queen side, the result should never be in doubt. And the reason for that is when I play a4, if white tries to take the pawn or go b4, it doesn't really matter which move. I have e5 here, hitting the rook. Very few squares left on the board to guard the bishop. If white plays rook h4, there's g5 here. And after bishop d3 check, I go e4, takes, king g7, and the rook is simply trapped on the edge of the board. There are no squares to move the rook to. So Volkodov plays king f2, king g7, king e3, but even here I can just go king f8, ignoring the pawn trade. And the reason it's important is because in this endgame, white will end up with either a passed a pawn or a passed b pawn. Now, regardless of which pawn he gets, my king wants to be in the center so it can run over and stop this pawn as quickly as possible. So it's very nice that here I can play king f8 and still refuse to trade the pawns until my opponent forces me to, because if white plays b takes a4, I have e5, rook to h4, and now I can go g5, hitting the rook. Same problem where the rook has no squares on his fourth rank. And after rook h6, king g7, I hit the rook, guard the knight, and I hit his bishop at the same time. And after all these trades, white is still probably drawing the game here, but my king is very quickly getting over to the queen side, and so I can stop these doubled a pawns. So Volkodov goes rook d8. Now I play king to e7. We get rook to a8. Here I have to swap the pawns, and now he takes with the a pawn. Now, bishop takes b3 I thought was a better try here, trying to just keep the pawn as wide as possible on the a file, as far away from the king. But in this position, after, say, rook b7, white doesn't really have a way to start pushing p on the queen side. And if you ever move the bishop, suddenly the rook starts getting very active, and we have a kebab on the second rank. So Volkidov takes with the pawn, and now I play knight to d5 check, and here he decides to trade the bishop for the knight. Now, one cool line here that could happen is king d4, and I think during the game I wasn't sure if I would play rook d7 or knight b4, but if I do go rook d7, king c5, rook c7, if white plays king b5, this loses on the spot because I can sack the rook with rook takes c4. If white checks the king, I block with the rook and win the game with the extra horse. If white takes with the king, I fork with knight to b6. Knight b6, forking the king and the rook here. And if he takes with a pawn, I have knight c7, forking the king and the rook this way. And suddenly it's GG, why not? Because after king c6 takes, king b7, there's king d6, king a8, and now I go e5, king b7, king c5, king c7, f5, and I just push p, and I get a queen, and I win the game. So Volkidov doesn't take any risk here after knight d5. He simply trades the bishop, and after pawn takes bishop, I offered Volkidov a draw here, and he accepted it because we're now in a rook and pawn endgame. Both sides have a rook and 4 pawns here. One sample line that probably would happen is something like king d4, and rook b7 takes, and white goes rook a2 just to stop rook b2 with the kebab. And after king f6, king e4, white can just walk the king back, and we have 3 pawns each, rooks on the board, and it's a very boring draw. So after e takes d5, we agree to draw the game. This means that I am now on 2.5 points out of 3. A pretty stable game. I tried to create something by playing the Siciliano. It wasn't meant to be. My opponent was more than up to the task, and it just kind of petered out into a draw. So a little bit disappointing that I didn't get any chances maybe to try and win the game. But when your opponent plays like this with the white pieces, it is what it is. And at least I did not lose the game. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from round number 3 of the Qatar Masters being held in Doha. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already. And I will be back tomorrow after my 4th round game, hopefully with the white pieces in this great open